I was born in 1911 in a small village near Moscow. Life was simple back then. My family worked the land, harvesting what little we could, living by the seasons. My parents had been part of the revolution in 1917, and although I didn't fully understand it at the time, I knew it had marked a pivotal moment. My father was a stern man, a former soldier who had fought for the Bolshevik cause, and my mother was a quiet woman, practical and reserved. They spoke often of Lenin, the leader who had promised to free the workers and peasants from the shackles of the old Tsarist regime. Before we continue, if you like stories like this and want more, subscribe and like, but now continue with a story. I don't remember much of the revolution itself. How could I? But I was raised in its aftermath, with the echoes of Lenin's promises still in the air. Things were different now. The Tsar was gone, and the people were told they had won the revolution for themselves. I remember our village, although small, was full of fervor. People were hopeful. In the years following the revolution, there was talk of a new world, a fairer one. Stalin, though not the towering figure he would become, was already making moves behind the scenes. In 1924, Lenin died. I was only 13, but I remember the weight of that moment. There was a profound silence in our home when the news arrived. My mother cried quietly, though my father remained stoic. It felt like the loss of something sacred, even though we hadn't fully grasped the magnitude of what was unfolding. Lenin was the revolutionary hero, the man who had led us to the promised land. But with his death came the rise of Stalin. At the time, I didn't fully understand how important this shift would be for us, but I could sense that something was changing in the air. I had been raised to believe in the ideals of the revolution, in the creation of a new Russia. My schooling, too, was shaped by these ideas. The teachers spoke of Lenin's greatness, and we were taught that the Soviet Union would lead the world to socialism. I joined the Komsomol at 14, and the sense of belonging was overwhelming. The posters on the walls with slogans like "Peace, Land, and Bread" and "Workers of the World Unite" made me feel like I was part of something monumental. It was a simple faith. The old world had been swept away, and now we were building a new one from the ground up. But even then, whispers of discontent began to surface. I heard talk of Trotsky. His opposition to Stalin was a murmur at first, but soon it became clear that Stalin was consolidating power. He'd already purged some of his rivals within the party, but for the common people, we saw little of that. In the villages like ours, the focus was on survival, and the promises of prosperity that the revolution had made felt distant. My father, who had once been so hopeful, grew more reserved with each passing year. He didn't speak much of Stalin, but I could tell that something had changed within him. There were no longer speeches in our home about the great workers' state that would rise from the ashes of the old order. Instead, he spoke more of caution, of not saying the wrong things. We had been told that the revolution would bring equality, that the new Soviet government would give us a better life. But the reality, for most of us, was different. Stalin's collectivization policy began to reshape our village. The government demanded that we hand over our land and livestock to the collective farms. The party promised that this would ensure prosperity for all, that the wealth would be shared. But as my father reluctantly gave up his few cows and pigs, he muttered under his breath, "We are being robbed by the state." And I understood, though I couldn't say it at the time, that his faith in the revolution had begun to crack. The collectivization was brutal. We were told that the kulaks, wealthier peasants who had more land, were enemies of the people, and many were branded as class enemies and either exiled or shot. The party told us it was for the good of the people, that we were building a stronger nation. But I saw the devastation. The land my family had worked for generations was no longer ours. The collective farms were inefficient, and the famine that followed, particularly in Ukraine, was something I could not ignore. I saw the skeletal figures of men, women, and children walking through the streets, their eyes hollow from hunger. It was then I realized that Stalin's promises of prosperity had been nothing but lies. The party's slogans, the ones that filled the streets of Moscow and the villages, began to sound hollow. The 5-year plan is a success was posted on every wall, but I knew that behind those banners, the people were starving. Still, the fear of speaking out, of saying the wrong thing, was always there. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, were everywhere. They watched us, listening for any sign of dissent, any hint of opposition. My friends and I learned quickly to watch our words. Any slip, any whisper, could lead to arrest or worse. By 1927, I was 16 and still in school, still part of the Komsomol. I remember that year clearly. It was the year Stalin's power solidified. It was the year he began purging those who had supported Trotsky and anyone else who posed a threat to his authority. The party began to speak in one voice, and Stalin's face was everywhere. Posters of him, with his piercing gaze and stern demeanor, became as common as those of Lenin had once been. They told us that Stalin was the father of nations, the protector of the Soviet state. And though I had doubts, there was still that voice inside me, the one that said, "This is what we fought for. This is what we believed in." But even as I tried to convince myself of this, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had watched the Soviet Union transform under Stalin's hand, from a place of hope to a place of fear. I had been taught that we were building a worker's paradise, but now it felt like we were living in a prison of our own making. The promises of the revolution had been swallowed by Stalin's thirst for power, and the Soviet Union was beginning to take shape in a way I never could have imagined. And yet, despite all the signs of something dark taking hold, there were moments of pride. The city was growing, the industry booming. We were told that the 5-year plans were working. Stalin was building an empire, and the Soviet Union was becoming a force to be reckoned with. We had put our faith in the revolution, and now we had to believe that Stalin's rule would lead us to greatness. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing fear that was taking root in my heart. By 1928, I was 17, and the Soviet Union I had once believed in felt both strange and familiar. The early revolutionary optimism I had been raised with was beginning to fade, replaced by something more ominous. Stalin's grip on the country had tightened, and what had once been a fledgling socialist paradise now felt more like an iron-fisted regime. The first 5-year plan was the heartbeat of this transformation. We were told that it was an ambitious effort to turn the Soviet Union into a global industrial power, to modernize the country and bring it into the future. Factories sprung up in the cities, but it came at a cost. The peasants, like my father, were ordered to give up their land, their homes, and their animals in the name of collectivization. The government promised that collective farms would be more efficient, more productive, and would lead to prosperity. But that wasn't the reality. The farms were inefficient, and the people who had worked the land for generations were now at the mercy of the party's bureaucracy. I remember the first winter after collectivization began. The fields lay bare, and the grain that had been harvested was sent to the state to fulfill quotas, leaving the peasants with barely enough to feed themselves. My father had once been proud of his small plot of land, where we had grown enough food to sustain our family. Now it was no longer ours. The collective farm was run by party officials, and we were told that we had to work harder to meet the demands of the state. The promise of equality rang hollow when we were barely scraping by. In the towns and cities, things were different. The 5-year plan had brought industry to life. New factories were being built, and Stalin's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to make us believe that everything was improving. I saw workers in the cities, their faces weary, but they wore a sense of pride. We were told that we were building the future, that the Soviet Union was becoming a powerful force in the world. But at home, the reality was much grimmer. People were starving. There were queues for food, and ration cards became the only means of survival for many. I stood in those lines with my mother, trying to get a loaf of bread or a few potatoes, hoping that we would make it through another day. The first time I truly felt the weight of Stalin's rule was when I saw the brutality of the NKVD. We had always been told that the Soviet government would protect the people, but when the party turned its gaze on the kulaks, those who were deemed class enemies, it became clear that Stalin's vision for the future was not one of justice, but of control. The party's enemies were enemies of the state, and the NKVD was there to deal with them. I remember a man in our village, a former teacher who had been labeled a kulak, being dragged out of his house in the middle of the night. His wife begged for his release, but they took him away, and we never saw him again. People whispered that he had been sent to a labor camp, but no one really knew. It wasn't just the kulaks who suffered. The party's purges had begun, and Stalin was beginning to remove anyone who posed a threat to his power. In the cities, in the party ranks, and even among the intellectuals, no one was safe. Those who questioned Stalin's rule, or even dared to voice an opinion, were arrested, tortured, or executed. The fear began to seep into every conversation. At school, we were still taught the glory of the revolution, but I could feel the tension in the air. Every teacher, every Komsomol leader was under constant surveillance. Everyone was a potential informer. By 1930, the Collectivization campaign had already caused a famine in Ukraine, but the government denied it. The party's propaganda machine kept churning out success stories about the 5-year plan, but the truth was that the people were dying. I watched as people from the countryside who had come to the cities seeking food were turned away at the gates. There were reports of people being found dead in the streets, their faces gaunt and hollow, their bodies nothing but skin and bone. Stalin, however, never wavered. The success of the 5-year plan was everything. The people's suffering was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. I was still a young man, and at the time I didn't fully understand the magnitude of the situation. I believed in the revolution, in the power of socialism, and in the promises Stalin had made. But as I watched more and more of my fellow citizens fall victim to the purges and the collectivization, I began to question what we were really building. We were told that we were creating a society based on equality and fairness, but what I saw was a society based on fear, silence, and oppression. The final blow came when the Great Purge began in earnest. In 1934, Stalin began a campaign to eliminate anyone he perceived as a threat. The party, the military, and even intellectuals, anyone who might challenge Stalin's power, were arrested, executed, or sent to labor camps. I heard the stories of show trials, where people were forced to confess to crimes they didn't commit, just to please the party. Some of the people I had once admired were now being labeled enemies of the people, and I couldn't escape the feeling that the world I had believed in was crumbling. I tried to distance myself from it, to continue on with my life, but it was impossible. Fear had become a constant companion, and the silence in our home when we spoke of the party and Stalin was deafening. It wasn't just the purges, though. It was the whole system. Stalin's vision of the Soviet Union was not a utopia, but a prison. We were taught that we were building something better than the old world, but instead we had built a machine of repression and control. I was no longer sure who to trust. The state had become everything, and we, the people, were nothing but pawns in its game. In those years, I began to feel the deep toll that Stalin's regime was taking on me. I had once believed in the promise of the revolution, in the hope that socialism would lead us to a brighter future. But that future, it seemed, was nothing more than an illusion. The truth was that the Soviet Union under Stalin had become a place where loyalty to the party was more important than the truth, a place where fear ruled and where the promise of equality had been replaced by terror and control. By 1934, I was a young adult, 23 years old, and the terror that had silently crept into our daily lives had now erupted into something undeniable. We had lived under Stalin's shadow for years, and as a member of the Komsomol, I had been taught that the revolution would bring about the greatest societal change. But the truth of the Soviet Union was far darker than the promises of equality and justice I had once believed in. The image of Stalin as a great protector of the workers had begun to tarnish, and behind his face of unyielding strength there was a suffocating fear that permeated every corner of our existence. It all began in December of 1934 with the assassination of Sergei Kirov, the Popular Party leader. I remember the shock in Moscow as the news spread like wildfire. Kirov had been a prominent figure in the Communist Party and an ally of Stalin's. His assassination was sudden, and there were whispers that Stalin had orchestrated it, but nobody dared to speak it aloud. Kirov's death was the catalyst that set off what we would later come to know as the Great Terror. Stalin, already deeply paranoid about potential threats to his power, used the murder as an excuse to launch a full-scale purge within the party and across the entire country. At first, it seemed like a far-off event, a tragedy that, while tragic, wouldn't touch me. But as the months passed, the terror that Stalin unleashed began to seep into every corner of life. People began to disappear. One by one, familiar faces were gone, and their places were filled with silence and uncertainty. I remember the first time I saw someone taken away. It was a neighbor, a man named Alexei, who had been a fervent supporter of the party. His wife came to our door, desperate, her face pale with fear, begging anyone who could help her husband. He had been accused of being a Trotskyist, a label that could mean anything and nothing. The NKVD had come in the middle of the night, taken him from their small apartment, and he was never seen again. It was the same for many others. The accusations were vague: ideological impurity, counter-revolutionary activities, espionage. The list of charges was endless, and what was worse was that once someone was arrested, Their families were often not told what had happened. People would simply vanish. Rumors swirled that some were taken to the infamous Lubyanka prison in Moscow, others to the remote gulags in Siberia. But what chilled me most was the knowledge that we were all potential targets. No one was immune, not even those who had been loyal to the revolution from the beginning. The purges didn't stop with ordinary citizens. They reached into the highest levels of the party, and one by one, Stalin's former allies were dragged down. I heard about the trial of Kamenev and Zinoviev, two men who had been central to the revolution, who had once stood beside Stalin. They were accused of plotting against him, and under intense torture, they confessed to crimes they never committed. I couldn't believe it when I read their confessions in the papers. They were tearful, desperate, publicly humiliated. Stalin's grip on power was so complete that even those who had helped him rise to the top could not escape his wrath. As the purges deepened, I began to feel the suffocating weight of fear. It was everywhere, seeping into every conversation, every glance. I saw comrades from my Komsomol days who had been outspoken in their support of Stalin's policies begin to disappear. They were the lucky ones, those who were arrested and imprisoned. But there were others, the ones who never returned. It was as though the ground itself swallowed them whole. In the mornings, we would wake up to find that the man who had lived across from us the night before was now gone. It wasn't safe to talk openly anymore, not even to friends. Who could you trust when anyone, even the people you had known your entire life, could turn out to be an informant? I tried to keep my head down, to do what was expected of me. I attended the party meetings, took part in the propaganda campaigns, and followed the orders of the party. But even then, I knew it was all a game. We were all being watched. At work, at school, in the streets, there were always eyes on us. Every conversation was a potential trap, every opinion a risk. Stalin's name was revered, but beneath that reverence, a growing sense of unease lingered in my heart. How long would it take before I, too, was labeled an enemy of the people? The fear grew even more intense when the great show trials began. These were staged trials where prominent party members, many of them former allies of Stalin, were publicly accused of crimes and sentenced to death or exile. They would stand in front of large audiences, confessing to crimes they had never committed, and in some cases they were forced to denounce their own families. I could hear the sobs of the families of the accused as they watched their loved ones humiliated, knowing they would never see them again. The trials were not about justice. They were about Stalin's need to eliminate any potential threat to his power. The most heartbreaking part was that it seemed to work. The people were afraid, too afraid to speak out, too afraid to question what was happening. During this time, I began to see the disillusionment that had slowly crept into the hearts of many. The revolution we had fought for, the utopia we had been promised, was nowhere to be found. Instead, we were living in a nightmare, a world of constant surveillance and fear. I had seen the power of the party's propaganda, and I had believed in it once. But now, I could see the cracks, the lies. The revolution had been turned into a tool of oppression, and Stalin's regime had become a machine that ground the lives of the people into dust. And still, there was no escape. I remember standing in line for food one bitterly cold morning, my breath visible in the air, and seeing a man who had once been my friend. He had been an avid supporter of the party, but now his eyes were hollow, his face gaunt. He said nothing to me. but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. We were all living in a state of paralysis, a society where silence was the only form of survival. By the time I was 25, I had witnessed too much. The purges had consumed the country, leaving nothing but a trail of fear and broken lives in its wake. The Soviet Union, once a beacon of hope and progress, had become a prison, and I no longer knew how to reconcile the man I had been with the man I was becoming. By 1937, I had seen the face of Stalin's terror, but nothing could have prepared me for the overwhelming shift that would come in the years following. The purges had torn apart the fabric of Soviet society, and with each passing day we were forced to live under the constant weight of fear and suspicion. But while the internal terror grew, a new external threat began to loom over us. The world was changing, and the Soviet Union was no longer isolated. Stalin, whose paranoia had once focused on internal enemies, now had to reckon with the possibility of war, and the country, just beginning to heal from its own wounds, was thrust into the next great challenge. It was the year 1938 when I first heard whispers of the impending war with Germany. Hitler's rise to power in 1933 had sent shockwaves through Europe, but it was only in the late 1930s that the full scope of the threat began to take shape. Stalin, who had once sought to avoid confrontation with the West, began to take a more active role in foreign affairs. The Soviet Union had been isolated from much of Europe, but the increasing aggression from Germany and the rearmament of the Nazi forces made it clear that we would soon be forced into the fight. In 1939, the world was stunned when Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Hitler, a non-aggression treaty that seemed to signal an alliance between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. This agreement sent shockwaves through the country. To some, it was seen as a pragmatic move. Stalin had bought time for the Soviet Union to prepare for the inevitable war. But to others, it was a betrayal. The pact gave Germany free rein to invade Poland and sparked the beginning of World War II. But for us, the reality was that Stalin had made a calculated move to ensure the survival of his regime, and the price of that was the Soviet Union's tacit approval of Nazi expansion. I couldn't understand how to feel about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On one hand, it gave us time to prepare, but on the other, it tied us to a brutal and barbaric regime. The very idea that we had entered into an agreement with Hitler, a man who had already begun to implement his horrific policies against the Jews and other minorities, was deeply troubling. Yet, there was no room for doubt or dissent. Stalin's word was law. In the months following the signing of the pact, I began to feel the weight of the decisions being made by the party more acutely. We were preparing for war, but in a way, we were preparing for two wars, one against the Nazis and the other against the growing disillusionment and mistrust within the party. In 1939, the Soviet Union was also involved in the Spanish Civil War, supporting the Republicans against Franco's fascist forces. Stalin's motives were clear. He was building alliances with the leftists in Spain, but the cost was high. Soviet involvement in the conflict was heavy-handed, and the purges that followed were brutal. Stalin had no tolerance for dissent, even within his own ranks, and as Soviet agents infiltrated the ranks of the Spanish Republicans, it became clear that Stalin's influence was about power, not ideology. During this time, I saw firsthand the division in our society. While Stalin's hold over the Communist Party remained ironclad, The contradictions in his policies became more apparent. People had begun to whisper, both in the party and among the common folk, was this the path of socialism that Lenin had envisioned? Or had Stalin hijacked the revolution to serve his own paranoid ambition? Those who dared to ask such questions found themselves on the wrong side of the state. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was pushing ahead with military reforms. The Red Army was modernized, new weapons were being developed, and Stalin's military leadership was bolstered by a wave of new generals and officers. But there was also a looming sense of unease. The purges had decimated the military leadership, and many of the most capable officers had been executed or imprisoned. The Great Purge had not only targeted the party, but the very institutions that would have to defend the country against external threats. As I watched the mobilization for war unfold, I could see the strain in the faces of the soldiers. They were prepared to fight, but the leadership was fractured. How could we rely on a system that had crushed its own military elite? In 1939, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland in the wake of the German invasion. We had been complicit in this under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And while the public was told that we were liberating the oppressed peoples of Poland, there was a deep sense of cynicism among the soldiers. Many of them knew that this was a strategic move for Stalin to secure more territory, not an ideological battle. The cold, harsh reality of war had settled in for us. What had once been abstract ideas of Marxism and revolution were now nothing more than propaganda. The fight wasn't for the workers or the peasants anymore. It was for Stalin's power. The Soviet invasion of Finland, which began later in 1939, was another blow to the myth of Stalin's infallibility. The Soviet Union had underestimated the resolve of the Finnish army, and despite Stalin's promises of quick victories, the Winter War dragged on with heavy Soviet losses. For the first time in years, there were public questions about the military leadership. How could we be so ill-prepared for a war against a smaller, less powerful nation? The humiliation of the Winter War revealed the fragility of the Soviet system and made it clear that Stalin's power, while absolute, was not invincible. I saw the men who had once been so full of zeal for the revolution now question the very system that had promised them a better life. We had been told that the revolution was about equality, about solidarity, but now we were waging war for power, for territory, and for Stalin's vision of the future. The ideals of the revolution seemed distant, replaced by the stark reality of a dictatorship that cared little for the people it ruled. As the world shifted and the Nazi threat loomed larger, we were left wondering where the Soviet Union stood in the grand scheme of things. Stalin had made alliances with the fascists, and while the rhetoric of the party spoke of war against fascism, the reality was that Stalin's own vision for the Soviet Union was no less authoritarian. The question now wasn't just whether we could survive the coming war, it was whether the very idea of the Soviet Union as a land of equality and justice could survive Stalin's ruthless rule. By 1940, I had lived through more than I ever thought possible. The world around me was changing, shifting in ways I couldn't quite understand. The whispers of the past few years, those murmurings of betrayal, fear, and paranoia, had turned into something far more tangible. Stalin had purged the party, the military, and even the intellectuals. The purges had touched everyone, even those who had once fought alongside him. But despite the horrors, life had continued. though it seemed increasingly brittle, like the cracking of ice beneath our feet. The country, it seemed, was balanced on the edge of an abyss, unaware that the storm was already coming. The purges were a dark chapter, but they were not the only source of my growing disillusionment. By 1940, it was clear that Stalin's paranoia had begun to bleed into every aspect of Soviet life. Nothing, not even the simplest of gestures, was safe. Every word, every glance felt like a potential trap. The NKVD's control over our lives had become absolute. The fear of denunciation was suffocating. What had once been the hope of the revolution, an egalitarian society of workers, had devolved into a sprawling, terrifying state of surveillance. No one was untouchable, and no one knew who they could trust. Even the very idea of loyalty had become meaningless. I had always believed that the revolution, despite its faults, had been for the people, for the workers. But the reality was that Stalin had created a society where fear ruled, and any semblance of personal freedom was crushed beneath the wheels of his totalitarian state. I began to wonder as I turned 29 whether I was living in a country that was, in fact, a shadow of its former self. We had been promised a world free of oppression, a world where workers would have control over their own lives, but now we were ruled by a dictator who controlled every aspect of society. Even our thoughts were suspect. One of the most painful experiences of these years was the rise of Stalin's cult of personality. His face was everywhere, larger than life, a constant reminder of the party's omnipresent control. It was not enough for Stalin to be the leader, he had to be deified. Posters of him appeared in every corner of our lives, showing him as a wise paternal figure. Stalin is the father of nations, they said. And yet, as I looked at his face on the posters, I saw something else. I saw a man whose hunger for power had transformed him into a monster. The man who had once promised us equality was now our oppressor, the very embodiment of the state that controlled us all. The war with Finland in 1939 had been a crushing blow to the myth of Stalin's invincibility. The Soviet Union, despite its superior numbers and resources, had been repelled by the Finnish forces, who fought fiercely with little more than determination on their side. The Soviet losses were staggering, and the world began to question Stalin's leadership. We, the people, felt the shame of that defeat. How could we, a supposedly great socialist power, have been so humbled by a small independent nation? In the aftermath of the Winter War, Stalin did something that shocked many of us. He replaced many of the senior officers in the Red Army, but instead of promoting capable men, he relied on those who were loyal to him. The military had been purged so thoroughly that we lacked the leadership needed to defend ourselves. And that fear, that creeping sense of unease, settled deep within me. What good were we if the military we had relied on was crippled by Stalin's paranoia? What would happen if war truly came to our doorstep? And then came the rumors. We had heard of Nazi troop movements in Europe, but we were told not to worry. Stalin's pact with Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, had bought us time, or so we were told. But the growing evidence pointed to something else, something darker. German forces were advancing in the West, and despite the non-aggression pact, Stalin seemed unwilling to acknowledge that Hitler had no intention of honoring it. Stalin, wrapped in his own security, refused to believe that the Germans would invade the Soviet Union. But the truth was becoming harder to ignore. His refusal to act, to prepare, would cost us dearly. It was in those months that I saw a shift in the people around me. The same faces that had once looked at Stalin with admiration were now clouded with doubt. We had been promised a workers' paradise, but all we had was fear, repression, and uncertainty. There was no more talk of a better future. The country was bracing itself for something terrible. People whispered about the possibility of war with Germany, but they were too afraid to speak it aloud. The fear had become so pervasive that even the slightest mention of conflict could lead to an arrest. Despite all the tension, we carried on. I continued my work at the factory, still participating in the mandatory meetings and celebrations. But I felt hollow inside, as though something vital had been drained from me. The workers, once united in the ideal of building socialism, were now divided by fear. Stalin's paranoia had turned us all into potential enemies, and we all lived in constant terror that we might be swept up in the next purge. The only thing that mattered was survival. The future, once so full of promise, now felt empty. When June 22nd, 1941 came, I was not ready. We had heard rumors that Germany was planning to invade, but we had been conditioned to ignore such talk. We were led to believe that our strength, our loyalty, would protect us. But in the early hours of that morning, the sky above Moscow was filled with the terrifying roar of German bombers. The war had come just as the whispers had predicted, and the Soviet Union was not prepared. The Germans were not the same as the weak, ill-prepared Finnish army. This was a force bent on our destruction, and Stalin's inaction had left us vulnerable. The news came in waves, with reports of cities falling, of entire divisions of Soviet soldiers being encircled and wiped out. I stood in shock as I heard the sounds of air raid sirens, realizing that everything I had known was about to change. It was no longer about the revolution or the promises of the party. It was about survival. As I looked around at my comrades, their faces filled with confusion and fear, I realized that we were no longer living in the world of Stalin's promises. The revolution had been a lie, and now we were caught in the middle of a war that no one had prepared for. All we had was fear, and that fear was our only guide as we faced the horrors of the Great Patriotic War. The summer of 1941 brought the brutal awakening that we, the Soviet people, had dreaded for so long. I remember that morning clearly, June 22nd, 1941, when the sound of German bombers tore through the sky, shattering the fragile silence of Moscow. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. The sirens blared and people began to run through the streets, confusion and fear spreading like wildfire. The air felt charged with panic. The very ground seemed to tremble beneath our feet, as if the entire world was about to collapse. Stalin's assurances that the Germans would not invade, despite the warnings from spies and intelligence, seemed suddenly irrelevant. It was as if the earth itself had betrayed us. The invaders were here, and the weight of the reality struck harder than any bomb could. The Soviet Union had been caught unprepared, and the consequences were immediate and devastating. Moscow, our city, our heart, was not ready for war. We were told that we were building socialism, that we were strong. But in those early days of the war, it became painfully clear that we had neglected the most basic preparations for defense. I had been working in a factory as part of the war effort, making munitions for the army. The factory was an extension of the party's promise, an industrialized Soviet Union ready to withstand any attack. But when the first waves of bombers hit, the factory itself became a target. There was no grand, heroic defense. Just chaos, screams, and the rush to evacuate. The streets of Moscow were filled with people, civilians and soldiers alike, fleeing in every direction. The city was being encircled, and we knew that it was only a matter of time before the Germans would push forward. The first few weeks were a blur of air raids, constant alarms, and the terrifying thud of bombs. Moscow seemed so far removed from the reality of war when we had been in the classrooms of the Komsomol or marching in celebration of our achievements. Now, those achievements felt like distant memories, shattered by the force of the German war machine. I remember seeing men from my factory, young and old, hurriedly forming into makeshift units to defend the city. There was a sense of unity among us that I had never experienced before, but it was also born from desperation. Our commanders, too, seemed overwhelmed. The NKVD, which had once been so focused on silencing opposition, was now scrambling to maintain order amidst the chaos. But even in those first dark days, the fear of Stalin's purges was palpable. It wasn't just the Germans we feared anymore. It was the possibility of being accused of cowardice or treason, even if we were only trying to survive. We received the call to mobilize, to take up arms and fight for the defense of Moscow. I was given a rifle, and along with a group of other factory workers, we were sent to reinforce the front lines. I was terrified, but I also felt a strange sense of duty, as if this was the moment we had all been preparing for. But when we arrived at the front, we were met with a brutal reality. The Germans were advanced, organized, and well-equipped. The Soviet forces, meanwhile, were disjointed and disorganized. The gap between Stalin's propaganda and the truth of the battlefield could not have been starker. At the front, the soldiers who had once been proud defenders of the party were now questioning the very system that had sent them here. The war was not going as we had been told it would. The soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and morale was low. I saw men around me, brave men, who had fought in the revolution, now questioning whether they had been wrong to believe in the party's promises. Some even whispered that Stalin, who had promised to bring us to greatness, was the one who had led us to this disaster. But no one dared to speak openly of such things. Those who voiced dissent disappeared as always. We were taught to hold our tongues. I recall one night in late July when I sat in the trenches, looking out over the scorched land, hearing the distant sounds of artillery and gunfire. The sky was overcast, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning. I could hear the murmurs of the men around me, but there was no real conversation. We all knew what was at stake. Moscow was our last line of defense. If we lost it, the Soviet Union might collapse. But as I looked around, I saw only fear. Fear that we were not ready, fear that we were too far behind in this war. And then came the word of the first Soviet counteroffensive, a bold attempt to turn the tide of the battle. The idea of pushing the Germans back was daunting, but Stalin had made it clear that failure was not an option. We were told that victory would bring glory, that the motherland would triumph. But there was a disconnect between the propaganda and the reality we faced in the trenches. The harshness of the weather, the hunger, the exhaustion, it all weighed on us. I still remember the first time I saw the bodies. The ones who had fought bravely beside me, now lying lifeless in the mud, their faces twisted in pain. The war wasn't glorious, it wasn't heroic, it was brutal, exhausting, and filled with loss. But we pressed on. The soldiers around me grew quieter with each passing day. Some had lost all hope, others still clung to the idea of victory. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the realization grew. This war was far from over. Moscow was on the brink of collapse, but in the midst of the chaos, the people of the city rallied. We fought not just for the party or for Stalin, but for our homes, for our families. I realized then that it was no longer about ideology, it was about survival. The revolution had promised us a world of equality and justice, but now, all we had was the fight for our very existence. By the end of 1941, the Germans had been pushed back from the gates of Moscow, but the cost was immense. The city lay in ruins, and the Soviet Union was on the edge of collapse. The war had just begun, and the pain would continue, but in that small victory, I saw a flicker of hope. We had survived, and perhaps in the end, that was enough. The winter of 1942 was like nothing I had ever experienced. The Soviet counteroffensive had driven the Germans from Moscow's gates, but victory felt distant. The city had been battered, the people exhausted, and the war seemed to stretch on without end. The promise of a quick, decisive victory had been shattered, and what remained was a long, bloody slog, a war that seemed to take everything from us and give nothing in return. I was no longer the young man full of revolutionary zeal. I had fought on the front lines of the Battle of Moscow, and in those brutal weeks I had seen the destruction of not just the city, but of the ideals I had once believed in. The war had not brought the glory promised by Stalin's speeches or the hope that had fueled the revolution. It had brought only misery, despair, and the constant fear that the next day might be our last. By early 1942, the Soviet army had been pushed into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. We fought in the harshest conditions, freezing temperatures, mud and snow, and the constant shelling and gunfire never ceased. The reality of war had sunk in for all of us. We weren't fighting for socialism anymore. We were fighting for survival, and the people around me, the comrades I had once known for their courage, began to break. Some were shot down in battle, some were swallowed by the cold, but most of us were simply worn down, our resolve fraying with every passing day. I remember being in the trenches outside of Stalingrad, the city that had become the epicenter of the war in 1942. Stalin had declared that the city must not fall, that the Soviet Union would not give up this key strategic position. It was as though the fate of the entire country hung on the shoulders of Stalingrad, and we were the ones tasked with defending it, a city of rubble where every street was a battleground. The Germans, who had once advanced with ease, now found themselves bogged down in the urban sprawl. The fighting was close, personal, and brutal. Room-to-room battles, constant sniping, and ambushes became our daily life. The Germans were relentless, and we had no choice but to push back. The German army, which had once seemed invincible, now faced the fierce resolve of Soviet soldiers, but at a cost. The morale of the Red Army was low. We had seen too many of our comrades fall. We had endured too much, and there was no relief in sight. The food was scarce, the winter bitterly cold, and the bombardments never stopped. In the midst of all this, we were told to keep fighting for the party, for the revolution, for Stalin. But in the depths of the trenches, the slogans and promises felt meaningless. What we wanted, what we needed, was survival. The war had become a test of endurance, and each day we lived was a small victory in itself. I remember one night huddled in a trench with a group of men. The night was as cold as the grave, and we passed around a small ration of bread and water. The air was thick with smoke from the constant artillery fire. The men around me spoke little. We had all become accustomed to silence, to the understanding that any word, any hint of weakness could lead to an early death. There were rumors, whispers, about how many had died in Stalingrad already. Some said the casualties were in the hundreds of thousands. I didn't know if it was true, but I could feel it. The weight of loss in every corner of the city. It was in the eyes of the men around me, in the faint echoes of screams carried on the wind. I had grown up believing in the promise of the revolution. We had been taught that Stalin was the protector of the Soviet Union, that he would lead us to greatness. But in those trenches, the vision of socialism that I had once clung to seemed far removed from the reality I was living. The soldiers around me were not fighting for an ideal anymore. They were fighting for the chance to live another day. Some of them I could see had lost their faith. They had no trust in Stalin, no trust in the party. They fought because they had no other choice. The battle for Stalingrad lasted for months. The city, once a symbol of Soviet resilience, became a symbol of suffering. By the time the German forces began to retreat in early 1943, we had paid a terrible price. The Soviet victory was one of the most significant in history, but the cost was beyond measure. The dead were countless, the wounded were innumerable, and in the aftermath there was little left but the ruins of a city, the memories of comrades lost, and the bitter taste of survival. As we moved out of Stalingrad and into the fields beyond, I felt both relief and sorrow. We had won, yes, but what was the cost of that victory? The faces of the men who had died in Stalingrad haunted me. The families left behind in the wake of our losses were left to pick up the pieces, to rebuild lives from the ashes of a city that had once been so vibrant. And yet, there was no time for grief. We were soldiers, and there was still more to be done. The war was far from over, and we, the survivors of Stalingrad, would be sent into the next battle. For all the promises of a better life under socialism, for all the idealism that had once filled my heart, I had come to understand the truth of the revolution. The Soviet Union, under Stalin's rule, was not the utopia we had dreamed of. It was a land of suffering, of constant fear, and of unrelenting war. But we had survived. And in that survival there was both pride and an aching emptiness, a feeling that I had been robbed of something more precious than I could ever explain. The war had changed me, as it had changed all of us. But as I stood amidst the ruins of Stalingrad, looking at the men who had fought beside me, I understood something deeply. The revolution was no longer my guiding light. It was the people, the comrades, the soldiers, the survivors who mattered now. The struggle was no longer ideological. It was human, raw, and unrelenting. And it was that struggle that would carry us forward, whether we liked it or not. The winter of 1943 was both a time of hard-won victory and unbearable loss. We had survived Stalingrad, but the price had been steep. The streets of the city were littered with rubble and the bones of comrades who had fought alongside us. The Soviet Union had won one of the greatest battles in history, but it came at the cost of more lives than I could ever count. The victory felt hollow. We had stopped the German advance, but the war was far from over, and the scars of Stalingrad, both physical and emotional, remained with me as we moved forward. We were pulled from Stalingrad to regroup, though there was no real respite. We didn't have time for mourning. We had to keep moving, keep fighting. The war continued, and with it came new battles, new fronts. The German retreat from Stalingrad marked the beginning of the Soviet counteroffensive, and as the months passed, we began to push the Germans out of the Soviet Union, inching our way westward. But with each victory, I felt the weight of the cost grow heavier on my shoulders. I remember the first time I saw the landscape beyond Stalingrad after the battle had ended. The city that had once been a vibrant symbol of Soviet industry and power was now a desolate ruin. We had taken it back, but at what cost? The soil, the streets, the very air felt tainted with the blood of those who had fallen. And as we moved through the wreckage, I realized how much we had lost, not just in terms of soldiers, but in our humanity. The horrors we had witnessed, the faces of comrades who had died in the trenches, and the faces of the civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. All of it was impossible to erase from my mind. I had always been a loyal man, someone who believed in the ideals of the revolution. I had believed that Stalin's regime would bring the Soviet Union to greatness. But standing amidst the destruction, I began to wonder if the price of that greatness was worth it. The party had promised us victory, but what had we truly won? Was it the revolution we had fought for, or simply Stalin's vision for a totalitarian state? I could feel the cracks in my beliefs widening, but there was no place for doubt in a time like this. The war was everything. The struggle for survival was everything. We had to keep going, not for the ideals we had been taught, but for the people who had fought beside us. I saw that same loss of belief in the eyes of the soldiers who marched with me. Many of us had entered the war full of zeal for the revolution, for the Soviet ideals, but as the war dragged on, and as more of our comrades fell, we began to lose that idealism. We fought not for the party, not for Stalin, but for each other, for survival. The slogans of the revolution, the promises of the Communist Party became meaningless in the face of the immense suffering we endured. But even as we questioned the meaning of the war, there was no escaping the reality of our situation. We were soldiers, and our mission was clear: push the Germans out of our land and end this war. The Soviet machine moved forward, and we moved with it. Every town we liberated, every inch of land we took seemed to come at the cost of countless lives. Our own ranks had been thinned, and we no longer had the same energy we once had. But we kept going. There was no other choice. By 1944, we had made significant progress. The Germans were on the retreat, and the Red Army was pushing deeper into occupied territory. We had liberated much of Ukraine, and the Western Front was starting to show cracks in the German defenses. The Soviet Union was slowly gaining the upper hand, but the sense of victory was bittersweet. We had endured so much, and there were times when it felt like we had lost more than we could ever recover. The war had changed us all. I recall one quiet evening during a brief ceasefire in the middle of 1944. We were stationed in a small village in the countryside, far from the front lines for once. There was a rare moment of peace. I sat with a small group of soldiers sharing a meager meal, the first real food I had tasted in weeks. The conversation was quiet at first, and then, almost in unison, we began to talk about what we had left behind. Some spoke of their homes, their families, others about their hopes for the future. There was a strange tension in the air. as though we were all afraid to voice what was on our minds. The loss, the devastation, the futility. We had all lost so much, but what did we have to return to? One of the older soldiers, a man who had seen the revolution firsthand, spoke up. His voice was rough from years of hardship, but there was a sadness in it that I had never heard before. "What did we fight for?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stalin promised us a better world, but all I see is death and ruin. I don't know what we're fighting for anymore." No one answered him. We all knew the answer, but there was no comfort in it. We were fighting for survival. We were fighting to protect our homes, our families. But we were also fighting for something else, something that felt distant and fragile. We were fighting for a future, but that future seemed as uncertain as ever. The war had become more than just a conflict between two nations. It had become a battle for the soul of our nation. What would be left when the fighting ended? What kind of country would we return to? The war was not over, but as I sat there looking at the faces of my comrades, I knew that we had already been changed. The revolution, the ideals of socialism, the promises of the party, they no longer felt real. We had seen the price of power, and it was far higher than we had ever imagined. Our country was being rebuilt, but it would never be the same. We had fought for survival, but the cost of that survival was beyond anything we had ever prepared for. The war continued to rage on, and we pushed forward, but in the quiet moments we could not escape the thought that we had lost something much greater than the battles we had fought. The Soviet Union, like the men who fought for it, was broken, and what remained we had yet to fully understand. As 1944 came to a close, we had seen the turning tide of the war, but the cost weighed heavier with every passing day. We had pushed the Germans from the Soviet land, reclaimed Ukraine, and fought our way through the Eastern European territories. But even as we advanced, it became clear that the war was no longer just about defeating the Nazis. It had become about something much more complicated, something I had not fully understood until now. The cost of survival, the price of victory, and the toll on the very soul of the Soviet people. I had been fighting in Poland, one of the last strongholds of German resistance, when I first felt the bitter irony of our situation. We had been told that the war was for the defense of the motherland, for the protection of the people, for the preservation of socialism. But as we moved westward, liberating town after town, I began to question what we were really fighting for. The people we liberated were scarred by years of occupation, some of them betrayed by the very system we had fought to uphold. There was no joy in the faces of the citizens of Poland when we arrived. There was only fear. I remember one particular moment in Warsaw. We had just entered the city, the streets littered with debris from the bombings, the walls shattered, the buildings reduced to rubble. We were given orders to maintain discipline, but there was something in the air, a kind of silent tension that spoke of something deeper than just the devastation of war. As I passed through the streets with my comrades, I noticed the wary looks of the people, their eyes averted as we marched by. They had seen so many men in uniform, so many promises of liberation, only to be betrayed by the next army that came marching through. I began to understand that what we were fighting for was not just the defeat of the Nazis. It was the future of Europe itself, and that future was far from certain. Stalin's promise of a workers' paradise seemed increasingly distant as we pushed further into Eastern Europe. We had seen the suffering of the people under German occupation. But as we moved forward, we saw the fear of Soviet control take root. Some whispered about the NKVD's reach, how the secret police had begun to infiltrate the cities we liberated, establishing communist regimes in countries that had once longed for freedom from oppression. I watched as some of my comrades began to question the party's true intentions. Were we liberating these countries, or were we simply replacing one tyranny with another? As we pushed through Germany's defenses, the human cost of this war began to overwhelm me. Every day we advanced, more men died. We lost friends, comrades who had fought by our sides in the trenches of Stalingrad, in the fields of Ukraine. Their bodies, their faces, haunted me in the quiet moments of rest. I could feel the weight of their absence with every step I took forward. I had survived, but what had I survived for? The dream of the revolution, of a just society built on the principles of socialism, felt distant and irrelevant as the war raged on. By the time we reached Berlin in April 1945, the war was nearly over. The Germans were in full retreat, their defenses crumbling, but the toll of years of fighting had drained me of any sense of triumph. I stood on the banks of the Elbe River, watching as Soviet and Allied forces began to encircle the city. It felt like an anticlimactic end to a long nightmare, not the glorious victory that had been promised. There was no sense of joy, no celebration, only the weight of the dead. In Berlin, the city that had been the heart of Nazi power, I could only think of the faces of the men I had lost, the families torn apart by the war. The final days of the war were surreal. We had captured the Reichstag, and the Soviet flag was raised over Berlin, but it was not the moment of triumph we had been promised. Instead, it was a moment of exhaustion. The sounds of the battlefield had grown fainter, replaced by the eerie quiet of a city that had been reduced to rubble. The Germans had surrendered, but there was no real sense of victory. I stood among the ruins, unable to reconcile the image of the Berlin I had once seen in the propaganda films with the devastated city before me. In the months following the German surrender, as the Soviet Union began to reclaim its hold over Eastern Europe, I realized that the war had changed everything. What had once been a struggle for the ideals of socialism had become a struggle for survival, for power, and for control. The Soviet Union, having defeated the Nazis, now faced the challenge of rebuilding a world that had been broken by the war. But the cost of that victory had left its mark on all of us, physically, mentally, and morally. I had lived through the revolution, fought in the trenches of Stalingrad, and survived the horrors of war. But when the fighting ended, I found myself at a crossroads. The man I had once been, the young idealist who had believed in the revolution and in Stalin's promises, had been replaced by someone hardened by the brutal realities of war. The Soviet Union had won, yes, but it had won at the cost of everything it had once stood for. The victories we had celebrated in the fields of Stalingrad, in the ruins of Berlin, felt empty. The revolution I had fought for had become something else, something darker. As I stood on the battlefield watching the rise of Soviet power over Eastern Europe, I couldn't help but feel a deep sorrow. The war was over, but what had been won? The price had been too high and the future was uncertain. Stalin had promised us a workers' paradise, but all we had now was a broken, war-torn world that seemed incapable of fulfilling those promises. The hope that had once burned in me now seemed distant, smothered by the harsh reality of survival. In the end, the only thing that remained was the understanding that the war had changed us all, and that no one, not even Stalin, could undo the damage that had been done. The war was over, but for many of us the struggle had only just begun. As the Soviet Union emerged victorious, the celebrations were hollow, almost forced. Berlin lay in ruins, its streets filled with the remnants of the Nazi regime, but the Soviet Union had won at a terrible cost. The banners of victory hung high in Moscow, but beneath those symbols of triumph, there was a lingering question that none of us dared to voice. What had we really achieved? I had seen the horrors of war up close, the endless deaths, the suffering, the terror of living under a regime that demanded blind loyalty. We had fought for survival, not for the grand ideals of socialism, but simply to stay alive in a world that seemed determined to destroy us. We had liberated countries from the Nazi yoke, yes, but now the Soviet Union was imposing its own brand of control on these same nations. The promise of a workers' paradise, of equality, had become a distant memory. Stalin's vision for the future of the Soviet Union was not the one I had signed up for. It was a vision of domination, of power, and of repression. As we returned to our families and our homes, there was no time for rest. The war had taken everything from us, our comrades, our youth, and our faith. Now, in the aftermath, the party was reshaping the Soviet Union in its own image, and Stalin's control over the nation was more absolute than ever. The great patriotic war had become a symbol of Soviet strength, but the true cost of that strength was only beginning to be felt. The purges that had scarred us during the 1930s had been replaced by a new kind of fear. People who had survived the war were now forced to live in a society where dissent was as dangerous as ever. The NKVD, which had once arrested and executed people for political reasons, now turned its attention to ensuring that the population remained loyal to Stalin's regime. People still whispered in the streets, still lived in fear of being labeled enemies of the people. The atmosphere of paranoia that had haunted us during the purges had never truly left. It had merely adapted, becoming more insidious, more ingrained in the fabric of our daily lives. I returned to Moscow in 1945, only to find that the city, like the rest of the country, was a shell of its former self. The war had destroyed much of our infrastructure, our homes, and our economy. Yet Stalin's regime insisted that we had won, that the Soviet Union had emerged victorious and strong. But I could see the truth. The victory had come at a cost that we could never repay. The faces of the soldiers who had died in Stalingrad, in the fields of Ukraine, and on the streets of Berlin haunted me. We had won, but we had lost too much to ever feel truly triumphant. There was a strange bitterness that lingered in the air. The war had given us the chance to fight for the motherland, for the party, but now, in the aftermath, I began to wonder whether the Soviet Union was truly the place we had fought for. Stalin's promises of a just, egalitarian society had been swallowed up by his own need for control, his thirst for power. He had purged his own people, silenced his own comrades, and forced us to live under the constant shadow of his rule. In the months following the war, I saw the Soviet Union begin to reshape itself under Stalin's guidance. The state continued to claim victories, economic, political, military, but I knew better than to believe the propaganda. The 5-year plans, which had been celebrated as successes, only further entrenched the regime's grip on power. There were still shortages, still hunger, still fear. The party's control over the economy was total, and the people had little say in their own futures. The state's promises of prosperity and justice felt more like lies, the kind that were repeated endlessly to keep us in line. I saw the changes in myself, too. The young man who had marched to the front lines full of hope for a better world was gone. In his place was someone hardened by years of war and fear, someone who had learned that survival came at the expense of ideals. I had once believed in the revolution, in the idea that socialism would bring about a better world. But after everything I had seen, I was no longer sure what we had fought for. But despite the disillusionment, there was still something inside me that kept me going. Maybe it was the bond I had formed with my comrades, the men who had fought alongside me, who had endured the same hardships. We had been through hell together, and in some strange way that bond held us together. We had survived, and in that survival there was a kind of defiance. We had witnessed Stalin's atrocities, his manipulation of power, but we had endured it all. We had witnessed the horrors of war, and still we stood. That in itself was a kind of victory. Yet, as the years passed and Stalin's grip on the Soviet Union continued to tighten, I couldn't shake the feeling that the country we had fought to defend was not the country we had imagined. The revolution had promised equality, freedom, and justice. But under Stalin, those promises were hollow. We had lived through the terror, the purges, the betrayals, and now we were left with the remnants of a world that had never come close to the utopia we had been promised. The Soviet Union had won the war, but at what cost? The scars, both physical and emotional, would remain with us forever. In the quiet moments when I reflected on what had been lost, I realized that the war had taken more than just lives. It had taken the ideals we had fought for. The revolution was no longer about building a better future. It had become about survival, about power, and about control. The country we had fought to create, the world we had dreamed of, had been consumed by Stalin's insatiable need for power. And yet, as I stood there looking out over the war-torn land, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. We had fought and survived, not for the promises of the party, but for something more, for each other, for the people who had stood beside us even when the world had crumbled around us. We had lost so much, but we had not lost our will to survive. That, in the end, was the one thing Stalin could never take from us.